Is there anyone who did not get handouts for 6 and 7? Who wants them? 6 and 7. Okay. 7 is going to be for next week. We're not going to get to 7 today because we've got a lot of setup that needs to be done. So we'll finish up with the book of Genesis today, talking about Joseph, finishing up with Jacob, and then talking about Joseph, and then we will talk about the Egyptians. Realize I didn't get the other one. Okay, last time we talked, we were talking about the patriarchs. We talked about how Abraham left from Ur. Where's Ur? That's Mesopotamia. Where's Mesopotamia? I can't even say it.
The Euphrates rivers.
Miss
Ur
Carol, like
is
it's that way.
toward the Tigris. Or to the Euphrates. Sorry.
All right, I'm going to take the aggregation of all the things you just said and say that it is way over here. Right here, right? There's your 2 rivers, right? Mesopotamia is the land between them. So from Ur, they went up. And where did they land?
Haran.
Haran or Haran or Haran or whatever you want to call it. I don't know anymore. But that place, which is in the region of
Padan Aram.
Padan Aram, right? Because that comes up as well later. So he went up there. They stayed up there until what happened? Yeah, his father, Terah, died, right? And then God called him again and said, go to the land of Canaan. And so he did. And so he took the southern trip here, landed in this area. The important cities that he landed in that you kind of need to know, Shechem, we talked about that one already. We talked about, down here. So he landed in Shechem, right? Also built an altar at Bethel, passed through Hebron, ended up in Beersheba, right? I mean, all these cities, he's kind of just sojourning back and forth through that area. Okay? So, we talked about all that. We talked about that he went through and built altars in those places. We talked briefly about Sodom and Gomorrah. Then we talked about how he went down to Egypt, and then he also almost sacrificed his son Isaac at Moriah. And we talked about Moriah. Where was one of those possible locations for Moriah? The only one we know, really.
Jerusalem Mount.
Yeah, it's a mountain in Jerusalem. And so there's some uncertainty about whether that reference to Moriah is referencing that mountain in Jerusalem or if it's some other place. If it's the mountain in Jerusalem, then that has some very interesting tie-ins later. So I'll make reference to that. All right, so then we talked a little bit about Isaac and Jacob and Esau, and we'll talk a little bit about Joseph here too. So Isaac and then later his son Jacob, they both sent, or actually Isaac sent his servant, or excuse me, Abraham sent his servant for Isaac to find Isaac a wife from Padan Aram, and then Jacob actually went up there after he had pulled his shenanigans and had to leave. Right, he went up to that region as well and stayed with Laban. And so I didn't have the map last time, but now I do. So let's pull this guy up.
And then what people were in the Padam? Who was, I mean, obviously they were strangers because they'd come from the Mesopotamia area, but what group was actually there that they were living among?
Well, I mean, you're talking mostly Syrians, I believe, in that area.
Okay.
If you look at this guy, zoom out a little well, I guess the Syrians would be more up in here.
Yeah, that's what I
Down here, I could pull up our table of nations, right? And maybe, actually, I can do that real fast.
I just wonder what kind of people they were living among. I didn't know who lived up there with Haran.
Right. You've got this says Aram, and from Aram came the Arameans, and so they were probably around in that area as well. You've got the Hittites that are up in here. We're going to talk about them today, and at some point they had started coming down this way, but that was probably a little bit later. So at this point, you're probably just talking about just your Canaanites that were in that area. That, you know, this is kind of there's not a whole lot going on right here. There's a few cities, Byblos and what do we call it, Urgit, and Ebla is somewhere, I think, over there too. That are some pretty important cities. But, you know, like we talked about, right? Most of this area, land of Canaan, the whole Levant area, was kind of just individual city-states. They were their own thing, right? They were pretty autonomous. And then every now and again, one of them would get too big for his britches and go try to attack somebody, right? And that just constantly happens. So you're talking, there's nobody that's really in power, I guess you would say, right there, over an extended
So
region.
it's kind of the in between, like the old Hittite Empire and the Assyrian Babylon
Right,
grouping.
right.
So kind of like a no man's land in between those two. Or,
Right, and again, you know, that kind of brings up some implications of why God chose this place in the first place, right?
well, I just wonder what kind of people they were living among. You know.
Yeah, I mean, they weren't like backwater folks or anything like that, but this was a more nomadic, kind of a decentralized area.
But not necessarily in a violent area either. This was
You say
violent, like they weren't necessarily in a.
well, I mean, like I said, you've got the individual city-states that every now and again there would be, you know, territorial battles going on there, but nothing like empires colliding kind of a thing. Not anything to that scale.
If you compare the maps, it looks like Haran is up closer to where that Eber and Peleg.
Yes. Yeah, so if you...
It's right on that little, whatever you call those rivers that run off the main river.
Right. So Haran is up here, right? And then if you look at... let me pull that off. If you go look at where Jacob and them are finding wives, I mean, they're headed up that way, right? And then... oh, no, it's the wrong map. Sorry. What was that? Well, where's the map I have? There's the map that shows Padan Aram.
Right there. It's right below Haran.
Oh, is it? Okay.
It's
Yeah,
that
there's
area
another
in
map that
between.
shows it like kind of lower, but I think it's like pointing that direction because that map that it cares about, all the stuff is on there, and it's pointing that way because there was a reference to Padan Aram. So yeah, so I mean he's headed up that way, and up there you are talking more of the Syrians and the Assyrians, and even like I said, maybe some of the Hittites, although they probably stayed on those sides of the mountains for the most part during this time. But yeah. All right, so we talked a little bit about that and how they went up there to get their wives. Jacob stayed up there for 14 years, right, to get both his wives. And then he comes back down. There is the journeys here that I wanted to show you about Jacob. So you pull this off. And just to kind of show you some of this stuff. And I know it's small, but if you want to look in your map, in your book,
Map 22.
Map 22 is what I'm being told. You can see this maybe a little bit. I don't know how well you can read this, which is on page 48. All right, so you can see here that, you know, he's cutting this path, right, and goes down to Beersheba, right? He that's where he gets his brother Esau's birthright. Up at Luz or Bethel, that's where God reaffirms his covenant. That's also where, when he comes back That's where he builds an altar. If you go, let's see, where was the other? Over here, right? That's when he wrestles with the man of God. And then that's also right when Jacob and Esau are reunited, right? So you can kind of see this path that he's cutting. And like I said, if you compare that path with Abraham's journey, I mean, you can see, right, they're pretty well right on top of each other. They're cutting through those same little areas right there in their travels. Okay? Jacob has 12 sons, and this is one of those lists. As we start getting into kind of a more stabilized period of history where we kind of know some dates, we kind of know some chronology of things, we're going to start putting together lists of things that we need to kind of just know. And this is one of them, is Jacob's sons. So do you know Jacob's 12 sons? Do you know them in the order in which they were born? If you know the song, you do not. I found that out the hard way.
Reuben was the oldest, right?
There you go. He goes down and then across. Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher, Issachar, Zebulun, Joseph, Benjamin. Okay? Is there a song in that order? I don't know that song.
She does.
Hold on, let me get the camera. Alright, so that's somebody's research project. Look up the song that has them in this order.
Your kids know that song.
My kids know that song.
12 sons of Jacob.
My kids do not.
They do, at least.
They did when I taught them, like when they were 4.
No. Well, they never sang it to me.
You had a CD.
That's
I
right,
gave
they
you.
did do it different than what I
Yes,
Did they?
they do.
You heard it better. I'm just kidding. Yeah, there's a different song that kind of goes more, it flows better. I don't know, I say better, I don't know the other one to know if it flows. But it flows pretty well. But it's not in chronological order. But this is chronological order, and I would like you to know this, right? There are some of these guys that they're not gonna, they're gonna kind of fall by the wayside in terms of historical significance. But there are some who are very important, right? Reuben is of significance historically just because he's the oldest, and he and is it Dan? No, not Dan. Which one's the other one? Gad, that didn't go across the river when it came time to take. Yeah, you can see him over here, right? Reuben and Gad. And so, getting ahead of myself a little bit, right? Those guys are going to play a part when it comes time to go conquer the land after they've come up out of Egypt in a few hundred years. Levi, what's important about Levi? That's the priestly lineage, right? That's from whom all the priests came. Judah, what's special about Judah?
Line of Christ.
That is the lineage of Christ, right? Judah is the kingly lineage, or however you want to say that. Joseph, what's special about Joseph? I'll tell you in a second, right? We're getting to that. And then Benjamin was the youngest. And again, all these guys, especially when we get into the Judges, you're going to hear these names a lot because it's right after they've gotten into the land, right? The tribes are kind of taking over their territories. And so a lot of these battles that we're going to talk about are going to mention these names, right? So because they're taking over their respective territories. So just keep that in mind. I would like you to memorize that. That's something that might show up on some sort of assessment at some point of knowledge. Anyway. All right. So that's a story on that. We also talked about Esau and how he became the father of the, don't read it, too late, Edomites. Forgot the Edomites. And where are the Edomites on your map?
They're down below the Dead Sea, aren't they? To the right.
to the right
Here's Dead Sea,
for these.
Edom down here, right? I also want you to notice, kind of tucked down here a little bit. Wow, that gets pretty grainy pretty fast. That says Mount Seir. Okay? That is an important mountain for you to label as well if you haven't already. Mount Seir is just down, go down from the Dead Sea, probably, 25 miles, 30 miles? And just a little bit to the right, Mount Seir, that's S-E-I-R. So if you got your map handy, you can label that. That's going to come up a lot when we start talking about the prophets, because the prophets mostly prophesied about Judah and Israel, right, the divided kingdom, but there were also references to other places, and Seir, S-E-I-R, right, that gets referenced quite a bit, and so we'll come back and visit that. Because if you don't know where this is, then you don't know who he's prophesying to. It's just some random city that you don't know, or territory that you don't know where it is. But if you know where Mount Seir is, then you know he's prophesying to the Edomites. And once we get through the story of them in the Exodus and the conquest, then you'll understand the implications behind that as well. Okay. All right, so let me hop off of this one. Hop off of this one, and grab the next doodad here. All right, so now we're getting into the next lesson, which is chapter 6 in your book, and it talks about the Egyptian experience, right? It sounds like a really cool concert series, but it's not. The Egyptian experience, this whole chapter is basically talking about the years of biblical silence during this time. Now, wait a minute, what? I thought the years of biblical silence were the time between the Old Testament and the New Testament. Well, that's one of them. But what we always forget, and I say we because I always forget, is that there's multiple periods like this where you just got, something happens and then we just pick right back up like nothing has changed. But about 400 years have changed, right? And so there's nothing there's not a whole lot that's said during this time. And the unfortunate thing is, we don't have any record of that from a biblical perspective. But the fortunate thing is, because they were in Egypt, and because Egypt is so dry and arid and not humid, that all that stuff got preserved really nicely so that we can go back and look, right? That's why we have so much knowledge about the Egyptians, is because it was so dry and so arid that all that stuff got preserved. It wasn't mildewed over or anything like that, like it would be around here, right? So we've got pretty good records here of what happened during those 400 plus years. Now, I know you can't see this, and this is not a chart that is in your book, but this is just kind of a timeline of Egypt and the Canaanite or the region of Canaan and their progression over time. And so I'll just kind of talk you through this. Over here around 1575, 1570 is when this picks up, and you've got transition from the Middle Bronze period to the Late Bronze period, and that may not mean a whole lot to you if you don't know the time frames, but you're talking about 1570 to about 1400 is that Late Bronze period. And so we need to talk about what's happened actually a little bit before that. And this timeline references the Exodus as happening in around 1450 BC. But we've already mentioned before in this class that that's one possibility. The other possibility is what's in your book. And in your book on chart 6, and that is on page 53. No, what? No, 64. Page 64. This has both of those. It has both of those scenarios, both of those possibilities. That instead of it happening around 1450 BC, that perhaps it was more like 1250 BC. So a couple hundred years difference. And we don't have time to get deep in the weeds on why those differences exist and why those alternatives. Why those alternatives are plausible or not, but I'll leave it at this, and you can read in the book if you haven't already some more of the details of it. But the biblical evidence seems to lean more toward a 1450 date. And when I say biblical evidence, specifically, if you want to go ahead and turn over to 1 Kings chapter 6.
So is that the first one on the chart?
That is the...
Is that the 13th century date for Exodus?
No, that would be 1250, right?
So we're looking, you think the.
So the
15th
1450 is over here,
The 15th century.
which is the 15th century, right?
Confusing you guys.
Yeah, I don't know why they put them on the wrong side of the page. Let me see, let me get to my Bible.
Where in Kings?
1 Kings, chapter 6, verse 1. You can do it. It's just a Bible verse. Okay. Switching to missiles. Let's see. 1 Kings, chapter 6, and verse 1. This is actually talking about Solomon building the temple. So this is way on down the line, right? But it's making a reference here to what's, to give us some sort of relative time frame of what's been going on. And you'll notice in verse 1, it says, in the 480th year after the people of Israel came out of the land of Egypt, and then a bunch of stuff, he began to build the house of the Lord. And we know about when the temple was built, right? The temple was built around 970 BC. And so if you work backwards 480 years, that puts you at about a 1450 BC time period for the Exodus, okay? There's not a whole lot more evidence than that, though. And, you know, this is translated 480th year, but there's also, some people think there's a reference to that being 12 generations. And generations, you know, they would calculate them at about 40 years apiece, and 12 times 40 is the 480. And they think that's where that's coming from. But really, 40 generations, 12 generations being 40 years, that's a bit misleading, because really from the time you're born to the time you start having kids is probably not 40 years. It's probably more like, 25 to 30. And you multiply that by 12 and you start to miss a good chunk of time, about 200 years, right? So, so there's some confusion about 1450. There's some evidence that points to that, but when you look at the archaeological evidence, both from Egypt and also the land of Canaan, it actually points toward more like a 1250 BC time period for the Exodus. And at the end of the day, it doesn't matter a whole lot, but it does kind of help us get things straight in our mind, and it does kind of help corroborate things that we see archaeologically happening during these various time frames. So just keep that in mind, that there is some discrepancy, and there's not, one way or the other, there's arguments to be made on both sides. But what I want to talk about is what happened before that. So I want you to flip back to Exodus chapter 1. All right, so while you're flipping back to Exodus 1, we'll talk about Joseph, right? We'll talk about the fact that he was the the next to youngest child, and he was the one that got sold into slavery because of his brother's jealousy. Remember this? He got sold to the Ishmaelites. Who are the Ishmaelites? Who's the Ishmaelites? Sons of Ishmael. And Ishmael was...
Hagar's
Yes, Hagar's
son.
son, right? So Isaac's, I guess, half brother, something like that. So there's all kind of ties back, right? So the Ishmaelites were sojourning down to Egypt, and so they sold him into slavery. So Joseph goes down there, and he ends up rising to power, right, because of God looking favorably upon him. And then he becomes second in command, and is finally able to, during a big famine, able to bring his family down to Egypt as well, right? And so, actually, that. So here, my computer's angry. Let's hope it hangs on. So here is where, and I don't know if you can see this, but that green up at the top, right? That was in Dothan, which is up here. That's where he went. Joseph went up to Shechem to find his brothers. And then his brother, or one of the guys there said, oh, they've gone on up to Dothan. And so that he went all the way up to here. And that's where they caught him, sold him, right? And so they probably went on this path all the way down to the land of Egypt there. And that's where he rose to power over the next, probably 13 to 15 years. It was after that Jacob's family, right, they started experiencing a really bad famine here. And so they went down to Egypt to buy grain, which Egypt had because of Joseph, in part, right? So they made that journey down. Now, the interesting part is that once Joseph reveals himself to them, says, I want you guys to come stay with me. This is at the end of Genesis, right? He says, I want you to, live here. He goes and talks to the Pharaoh, and the Pharaoh says, yeah, sure. Put them in the land of Goshen over here. And if you haven't labeled the land of Goshen, I think where's my mouse? Land of Goshen is kind of here on the eastern side of the delta. And Pharaoh, if you'll if you'll turn back a couple of pages in your Bible, or scroll if you've got it. Let's see, where is it? It's in it's where he talks to Pharaoh, and the Pharaoh tells him to so chapter 47, I can't find the verse, I forgot to write it down. Verse 27, that's where they settle in the land of Goshen. That's not what I'm looking for, though. I'm looking for where they actually have the conversations. No. You know where it is, though. It's there somewhere. Oh, here we go. Chapter 46, verse 31. This is when Joseph has revealed himself to his family. Verse 31 of chapter 46. Joseph said to his brothers, to his father's household, I'll go up to tell Pharaoh, and will say to him, my brothers and my father's household, who are in the land of Canaan, have come to me, and the men are shepherds. They've brought their flocks, and when Pharaoh calls you and says, what's your occupation? Tell him you're livestock, or keepers of livestock. And he says, in order that you may dwell in the land of Goshen, for every shepherd is an abomination to the Egyptians. And that was always weird to me, like, why were the Egyptians so loath to keep company with shepherds? I didn't really understand what was going on. But if you've read in your book, there's a pretty interesting thing going on behind the scenes that explains a lot of this, and it also explains why, over the next couple of hundred years after the Israelites had kind of grown in their population, that all of a sudden the Egyptians kind of turned on them and said, yeah, they're getting too numerous for us, we got to put them to work, right? What was going on is you had, we talked about Egypt beforehand, right? And how they were a pretty unified group for most of history. Certainly from the earliest times up till about this time, they were pretty unified. It was just Egypt. It wasn't all this infighting like was going on up here and this battle for territory. Egypt was pretty good up until about this point. And around the time of Joseph, or Jacob and Joseph, was when you started having a lot of migrants from this area start influxing into Egypt, right? And